Hey y'all, Scott here, and dimensions, am I right? I've decided to create a term to describe that dimension fever we all have from time to time. Dementia. Urban Dictionary doesn't know what's about to hit it. 2D, two dimensions that were at their peak in the early 90s. The Nintendo Entertainment System initiated a boom in game development at the time. Company after company threw their hat in the ring, putting out their own games, and when things moved on to the 16-bit era with the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, game development entered a bit of a renaissance. Developers were starting to perfect game controls, sprite work, and level designs. These systems were home to some of the greatest games of all time, games that felt like true evolutions from what we got on previous hardware. Rocket Knight Adventures, Super Castlevania 4, Mega Man X, Super Mario World, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Donkey Kong Country, games were not only getting better, but looking better as well. So, of course, the big question at the time was, what's next? A 3-for-1 combo deal in Dimensions, obviously. 3D was the next big thing, and everybody knew it. Some games gave off the illusion of moving in 3D space, stuff like F-Zero, Super Mario Kart, Pilot Wings, and whatnot. Some games look 3D, but were pre-rendered 2D sprites of 3D images, like with Donkey Kong Country and Sonic 3D Blast, basically meaning they created a 3D model, then took a picture of it and made 2D animations out of them. Definite steps in the right direction, but with the introduction of the PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and the Nintendo 64, we got the true vision of what the future of gaming was going to be. Jesus Christ. The transition from 2D to 3D is a process of physical changes through which a franchise's 2D roots mature into a 3D one capable of sexual reproduction. This is the Wikipedia article for puberty. 2D to 3D was tough for most series. Many would think it's as simple as taking the camera and just throwing it behind the character rather than to the side of them. While in theory, yes, that works, it's important to understand that 2D games and 3D games are incredibly different. Since 2D games have only one plane to deal with, it's much simpler to lay out things like obstacles and objectives. It's easier to fill out a 2D level with things for the player to do. Moving into a 3D space, you have so much more you can do. You can move in all directions, exploration is cranked up, infinite possibilities as to how you accomplish a task. But these things bring in a few problems that never existed in 2D games. It's much easier for 3D games to feel empty, and there's a lot more that goes into perfecting a 3D environment. More testing has to be done to ensure less bugs, more possibilities have to be questioned when programming, and some people just can't play 3D games, they're too complicated for them. Nowadays, developers understand what goes into 2D and 3D games much better, and both types have merit, can be loads of fun, and get equal representation in the gaming market nowadays. But back when 3D games were in their infancy, developers had to figure out how to take their 2D franchise and make it work in 3D while retaining enough aspects of its origins for fans to stick with them. Of course, the shining example everybody looks at for 2D to 3D has to be Mario. The original Super Mario Bros. Games were 2D platformers consisting of you getting to the end of dozens upon dozens of linear stages. Surely nobody's ever made or even thought about that statement before. It's surely going to be on my tombstone. When 3D came into the mix, the developers had to change up a ton with the Mario formula to remedy technical constraints and to correlate with jumping into the third dimension. Super Mario 64 had 15 worlds to explore, a far cry from Super Mario World, which contained over 90 levels. This is due to those 15 worlds having multiple objectives to do within them, rather than being one and dones like previous Mario stages. The developers discovered how much fun it is to run around and explore within a 3D space, and decided to focus on that aspect when designing Mario 64. It's obvious at first the developers thought about just a straight conversion of 2D Mario to 3D, as they stated they originally planned on the flagpole from the original Super Mario Bros. Being in 64 to represent the end of a stage. At the end of the day, they went with the more open-ended level design, as that was the most fun, plus it was obviously more resourceful and viable to design 15 large levels with multiple objectives rather than around 90 fully 3D stages. Super Mario 64 is definitely quite a bit different compared to the Mario games that preceded it, but it still feels like Mario. Probably because fundamentally when you get down to it, Mario's all about running around and jumping, and in that respect, Super Mario 64 did the series right in 3D. It sounded the part and looked the part definitely. Mario 64 keeps things pretty generic in the Mario universe, more than likely to keep the longtime fans comfortable with the big transition. Along with that, they had to explain how the camera system worked by making it into a character. That's how foreign camera control was back then. It does have some flaws and things that don't hold up well nowadays, but Super Mario 64 was a revolution and inspired everybody in the transition of 2D to 3D. It wasn't the first 3D game by a long shot, but it might as well have been. In comparison to Mario, when transitioning the Legend of Zelda series into 3D, it was much more one-to-one. Not completely, but it's easier to compare 2D and 3D Zelda games. Justifiably so, since the main format of Zelda at the time was top-down adventure games involving puzzle solving and combat. It's a lot easier to imagine this in 3D rather than this. You just throw the camera down and behind the character and wham, 3D. Of course, certain things had to be added and changed. The miracle of Z targeting was thrown into the mix to help out with aiming, and also having Link automatically jump across obstacles. That was nice of them. 2D wasn't completely killed off with the introduction of 3D though. The Castlevania series experimented with both 2D and 3D entries in the late 90s. The PlayStation received Castlevania Symphony of the Night, an evolved and refined version of Castlevania, now with RPG elements and an interconnected world with upgrades allowing access to more of said world, which was akin to the Metroid series, initiating the term Metroidvania. Castlevania on Nintendo 64 is clumsy and sloppy. Sure, Symphony of the Night was different from the older titles, but these games aren't really what people wanted from a Castlevania game. They were empty, boring, and fell victim to being early 3D games in a franchise that was primarily 2D. And that wasn't the only series that Konami stumbled with in terms of the jump. Contra Legacy of War, going from the fast-paced action of Contra to this. What a turnoff. But at least Metal Gear got a good treatment, with the Metal Gear series being top-down. It translated pretty well into 3D with the introduction of Metal Gear Solid. Game series didn't necessarily have to make the jump to 3D instantly. Sega's legendary Golden Axe series of beat-em-up games hailing from the arcades and Sega Genesis quietly faded into obscurity after the third entry. They're monotonous button mashers nowadays, but they still have their charm. Of course, Sega decided it was better late than never to catapult the series into 3D on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 with Golden Axe Beast Rider and, whoa, a mature reimagining of the classic. Beast Rider brings many new things into the series, such as bad. It's not good. It had the advantage of releasing well after 3D was well established, but this is just a poorly made, boring, repetitive hack and slash. Sega did a similar thing with Altered Beast, another arcade and Genesis classic beat-em-up, which finally made the transition into the fabled Third Dimension in a PlayStation 2 exclusive only released in Europe. On the other side of the quality spectrum, Tecmo brought Ninja Gaiden into 3D with a rebooted series premiering on Xbox, and these games are a fateful modern take on Ninja Gaiden in my opinion. Sure, they went from action platformers to more so hack and slashes, but they retained the difficulty the series was known for. Ninja Gaiden 3 was bad. You go from a Roman numeral 2 to standard 3, that's already a bad sign. Metroid took a hiatus after the critically acclaimed Super Metroid and didn't receive a 3D entry until the release of Metroid Prime on the GameCube, where the game shifted perspectives to first person, a move that initially was met with controversy and later praised hard. I'd say it was smart for these series to wait for a 3D jump, as it gave developers time to understand 3D game design. Of course, things like this still happen, but waiting can be beneficial. One series that's shockingly never made the full jump to 3D is Kirby. To me, it feels like the developers behind Kirby, HAL Laboratory, desperately want to make a 3D Kirby game, but some narc in the company keeps on refusing it, I guess. We get little tastes here and there, like Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards was 2D, but had some absolutely maniacal camera angles. Kirby Planet Robobot had a 3D high-score-based minigame, Kirby 3D Rumble, and Kirby Star Allies on the Nintendo Switch has fully 3D world maps, but with the main game taking place as a 2D platformer, and good god my heart aches for a game in this style. We've gotten Kirby Air Ride, a 3D racing game, and Kirby 3D Rumble was expanded into a 3DS eShop game, Kirby's Blowout Blast, but these two are spin-offs, and Blowout Blast specifically is a very small game. We could really use a fully 3D Kirby game. And Sonic the Hedgehog. The mega popular 2D side-scroller series had to wait and wait until they fully realized 3D adventure. Sonic 3D Blast came out in the mid-90s, and gosh, Sonic in 3D? Who are they trying to fool here? Sonic R was a 3D racing game, Sonic Jam featured a 3D overworld to screw around in, but no true 3D Sonic game until the late 90s. Sonic Xtreme was a 3D Sonic game in development for the Sega Saturn that was plagued with development issues and was eventually cancelled. It's obvious that Sega had quite a bit of trouble evolving Sonic, but it was Sonic Adventure that finally gave us a Sonic game in 3D. A lot had to be changed. Sonic was given the homing attack to home in on nearby enemies, helping fix some depth perception issues that come with 3D platforming. And developing 3D stages that utilize Sonic and his speed meant that levels had to be replayed with multiple characters to beef up playtime. It's obviously expensive making 3D Sonic levels since you go through them so fast. Adventure created a large world to roam around in, but was basically what was expected from a 3D Sonic game in the late 90s. And then Sega just didn't know what to do with this thing for the next decade. This wasn't a problem with the 2D games, they stayed relatively consistent. The 3D ones changed things up every single time a developer at Sonic Team sneezed, plus the quality of the games coming out were getting shakier and shakier. There have definitely been some really solid 3D Sonic titles, but the quality of them is undebatably less consistent than the 2D games. It's obvious that the jump from 2D to 3D was a bit shaky. I mean, just look at the series that waited until 3D was more refined. games had to change in this era due to 3D requiring design changes and technical constraints. However, recently developers, specifically Nintendo, have finally been able to translate their 2D game formulas into 3D. Super Mario 3D Land and 3D World play just like a 2D Mario game, but in 3D, and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is like a 3D take on the original Legend of Zelda. This is great, as little technical constraints nowadays mean we can get these versions of games fully realized, but I think the limitations that came alongside the jump from 2D to 3D were monumental in helping shape how games are made today. We wouldn't be where we are without the transition and the problems that came alongside it. Game developers learned so much about game design and discovered how much fun it is to discover things, to explore, to have infinite possibilities. This era may have been a bit ugly in some cases, but it was one of the most vital parts of gaming history. Fucking Bubsy, well, I have to say, this is what you call a game. And this is what you call incompetency. 2D and 3D are some killer dimensions, and both have merit in the video game industry, but I want everything to be 3D from now on, so I'm gonna get a little help from my eye doctor. Yeah, I've had better ideas.